Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very happy to be joined by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project today. How are we, Josh?
Doing pretty all right.
You look like, you're staying fairly cool for a guy in long pants.
Well, it's barely hot today, right?
Yeah, it's going to be hotter. I don't know. I feel like I've just given up on long pants for a while. We'll see how long that lasts. If you're one of the people I have a speaking engagement for, I am wearing long pants to speaking engagements. So
I'm wearing sandals.
Yeah, you are wearing sandals. I will,
so my feet are.
Maybe I can wear a suit and sandals to my next.
No, I don't think you can do that.
Yeah, my feet are pretty large. It doesn't get they don't get lost in the cuffs or anything.
That's a lot of foot exposure.
That's a lot of foot exposure. While there are things going on and kind of a lot once I stopped to think about it and started, realizing what was out there, it does certainly feel like on the ground in Texas, it's sort of the dog days of summer. The relentless heat here in Central Texas, combined with the realization, as we were just talking before we came on, that, the end of the summer on the school calendar anyway, if not the weather, is very much within sight.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, it's sort of been a running joke this summer about whether it's been quiet or not from week to week, and in some ways it almost feels quiet, but only relative to, the fever pitch of everything else that has been going on kind of perpetually, right? So it does feel a little quiet this week, but it's not because nothing's going on. It's just because it's a very little sort of that's blown everything up is going on.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So, we'll get to our usual Texas-centric discussion for the week, but as we record this on Wednesday morning, there's lots of discussion of Tuesday's primaries.
Right.
In several states, obviously not in Texas, but in several states. I mean, I think probably the headline this morning is in Kansas, and that was not a primary election. And in fact, in Kansas, there weren't any competitive primary elections in a predominantly Republican state, which is part of what's interesting here. But there was a lot of anticipation over the results of a referendum that would have allowed the Republican-led state legislature to further restrict abortion. And there's a lot of state-level history I won't go into that kind of led up to this, that in fact, this got on the ballot before the Dobbs decision, probably anticipating some, but also anticipating some things that were going on in state politics.
Well, there's a certain Me Too going on. I mean, a lot of other states were moving ahead, sort of enacting further restrictions, Dobbs or, in consideration of Dobbs or otherwise, right? There's certainly a Me Too-ism going along among conservative states.
Now, the outcome there was very interesting and is sort of leading much of the news, the political news this morning and last night. With 98% of the vote in, 59% said no to the amendment that would have, encouraged more restrictions on abortion. Only 41% voted yes. And what this, was going to do was sort of clarifying that the state constitution does not protect the right to an abortion. And remember, Kansas is a very Republican state.
It's a conservative place, right?
Yeah, and we talk about, Texas all the time. Kansas is, pretty red.
Yeah, very, very red.
And this was an election with pretty high turnout in the populous counties. And so, I think it's being taken, we can talk about, what do you think? Taken as a leading indicator of abortion politics. I mean, one of the takes, I think, is that, this has been more of a mobilization, appears to be more of a better mobilization issue for Democrats than Republicans. That, and I think that's not really news, but there were some people trying to say that the Republican base would be energized by this, by the Dobbs decision, see it as a success, go out, do more, feel energized. We talk all the time in here. It's like our weekly, reminder about, overinterpretation. Usually we're talking about poll results, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think I wasn't so certain going into this that either side had like an obvious advantage in terms of mobilization. For me, what I think about is who's voting for the status quo and who's voting for change. And ultimately, I think the thing that's and it's easy to kind of forget this in Texas where, the legal landscape has changed dramatically and very quickly. But the point is because, the Kansas Constitution does guarantee the right to an abortion, the reality is that, the Dobbs decision didn't change the landscape in Kansas the way it's changed the landscape in some other states. So to my mind, there was an argument you could make that actually the people voting yes, the people who ended up losing might actually have more energy behind them because ultimately they would actually be voting for the change, whereas the people, again, who ended up, winning, no, we're really just looking to maintain the status quo there. I think the fact that they so overwhelmingly maintained the status quo is, I think, obviously, I don't think there's any reason Democrats should interpret that in any other way than positively. But I think there's two things about this. One, I think the vote, looks pretty similar to kind of where public opinion looks, at least on the broad edges, I think. And certainly what it looks like in a conservative state like Texas. So there's that. But I've, saying this to other people this morning, ultimately the devil's in the detail and the devil's in the data here. Because really voting, having a referendum on abortion access, it's probably going to look a lot like public opinion. That is not the same thing as two candidates running for election of where abortion is one issue among many issues. And so I think, for Democrats, I think the question in the next coming days, and I think, here in Texas, we have someone who regularly kind of analyzes, the turnout in these kinds of races. It'd be interesting to see what that looks like in Kansas. Because for Democrats, what I would want to know if, you're sort of trying to interpret this realistically is, did you turn out people that you didn't think you would turn out?
Right.
In the counties where this really was over the top, were you seeing, people who never vote in primaries? Are you seeing people who haven't voted in general elections? Because ultimately what that says, and is there something about those people that's similar? Because that's where you say, is there a mobilization target for Democrats? Did they see, women under the age of 30 turn out at much higher rates than they've seen? There's whatever it is.
Right.
That's really kind of the questions I think we need to get into before we start thinking about what this is. But ultimately, like everything else, it doesn't mean that Democrats are going to go in every state where abortion is kind of central. They've got a 60-40 advantage. But what it might mean is that, there's a couple points to be shaved here and there by, finding voters who might not be engaged. And so I think that's the takeaway, not as exciting, but it's still certainly very interesting. And I don't think it was as obvious at the outset exactly what would happen there.
Yeah, and I haven't looked this morning. Some of the late night reports before everything had been counted were suggesting that there were, a lot of people that voted on this but did not vote in either of the primaries.
Yeah.
Right? In the six figures.
Yeah, but which
makes sense.
Yeah, well, and this is where, this is where I think one of
begs the question of who they were, as you were saying.
Yeah, and I think this is where, this is sort of this whole, big open question. Like, look, not the abortion issue is very much going to affect this election cycle. How it's going to in different places still remains an open question. It's going to kind of depend on how the politics plays out, right? Just ultimately.
Yeah.
And so, had they said yes, let's say, had the yes won, and then the question becomes, okay, what is Kansas going to do now, right? Well, ultimately, that becomes part of the campaign.
Yeah.
And that becomes part of the issue set that people are valuing the candidates on. And maybe then that does make something different happen. But that's why I think the space is so dynamic right now. I'm just kind of, I'm reluctant to read too much into anything.
Yeah. I think there's, the careful analysis. I think playing a little fast and loose. What I wonder is how much people will not wait for the analysis and begin to act on, particularly on the Democratic side.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's going to be a lot of, see, I told you. Mm-hmm. This is good for us, and
Yeah, and it is. You can't say it's not.
Good for us is a mobilization issue.
Yeah, no, you can't say it's not good for Democrats, but it would be very much like Democrats at this point to overinterpret this and, turn something that, is probably a marginal positive for them when taken into consideration of everything else.
Yeah.
And, making it into something that's, maybe just neutral, potentially negative in some places, but we'll see.
So, in other states, Arizona, Michigan, Missouri, the kind of overarching national story there, is, the catnip of what does this say about Donald Trump and his influence?
Yeah.
And I don't want us to get too far down the rabbit hole on this. I think we have talked about it on here before. We're still waiting to get some final results in Arizona. A couple of those races have been too close to call. If you're looking at this from a Trump-centric point of view, it was a mixed night.
Yeah.
Some of his candidates, several of his candidates did well. We did see, a couple more candidates go down on the congressional side that were, yes votes on his impeachment that had been targeted. We were talking before this, how much of this is about Trump? How much of this is about the broader, currents that Trump has surfed?
Yeah.
And the currents in public opinion and within the Republican Party that Trump activated. I kind of want to put a pin in some of this. I mean, there's some of the funny anecdotal things where Trump, Trump endorsed an Eric. Turns out the one he meant to endorse lost, but he was probably going to lose anyway in Missouri. The Eric Schmidt-Eric Greitens race.
Yeah, there's
for
a third
the
Eric
Senate
in there
nomination.
too. But I mean, this is just for me on this whole thing, I just, it's like part of what I try
I'm inviting you to
all right,
bitch.
I'm just going to jump in. I mean, like part of this
Just don't bitch for too long.
No, all right, let me turn my watch. Here we go. Okay. I mean, there's a couple things. One, I think it would be dumb to deny that, Trump's endorsement has an impact, right? I mean, ultimately, he's the former president. He's well liked within the Republican Party, pretty broadly here. And ultimately, in a primary election, which generally speaking, most voters are not going to have very well-formed opinion about a large number of candidates, knowing that the former president endorses someone should have an impact, right? We should expect that.
Right.
Having said that, right, ultimately, Trump is not making these picks in a vacuum. And the Trump-centric view of this, which is like, what does this say about Trump? I mean, ultimately, you kind of, I think there's a couple things. One, it's very easy to kind of go binary and say, well, did he win or did he lose, right? But number one, he's not picking these candidates in a vacuum. He knows, things about them. He knows what the situation looks like. Ultimately, I would expect Trump, like any politician who's going to engage in something like this, probably to shy towards giving more endorsements on sure things than on ones where he's really thinks, anybody could win this, or even worse, this guy's probably not going to win, but maybe my endorsement can push, him or her over. That's not really the way Trump plays. So ultimately, I think any sort of simple...
Trump doesn't have a spreadsheet.
No. So one, that's kind of, I think it's overdoing it, just in and of itself, because he's picking these, he's strategically picking these candidates one way or another for the most part, right? The ones that he's not strategically picking or not as strategically picking, when you're going up against someone who voted to impeach him, ultimately, again, Democrat, Republican, if you make a vote to impeach the president of your party when most of the members in your party do not, you are putting a target on your back.
Right. And I think most of the people in that position, sort of realize that to some extent. Now, the other subplot that intersects with this is the DCCC's, throwing money and ads behind pro-Trump candidates in primary races that they were hoping to help in order to help the Democratic candidate in the general election. So, look, on one hand, we've seen this a lot. We've seen it in Texas where, candidates, the campaign organizations in both parties, they support a candidate in the primary that they think will be a weaker general election candidate come the general election in order to help their candidate in that election. But the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has gotten some press for doing this. And in one of the races last night, at least in Michigan, Congressional District 3, the candidate that they supported was a Trump candidate, a guy named Dobbs, who beat one of these candidates that had
Meyer,
voted.
I think.
Meyer, that had voted for impeachment. There's been a lot of discussion that under the circumstances, this is a little different than the usual strategic move that grown-ups in politics expect to see. I'm curious, we haven't talked about this, and I'm very curious what you think about this, because I have kind of a view of it I think I've settled on. Yeah,
I mean, let's see. I think it's stupid for Democrats to do this. I mean, to be honest, I think there's a couple problems with this approach, just generally. I mean, first of all, I think it's kind of a classic overreaction from Democrats, right? I think, to some extent, it's like, Democrats, and this is part of this, are looking around saying, there's all these threats to democracy going on, and there's these, candidates who are proposing things that we find, fundamentally very, very troubling, right? And given the fact that, I think Democrats feel that Republicans are so comfortable with the idea of playing with the rules and all that kind of stuff, this is sort of feels to me like a classic Democratic overreaction, like, well, we need to fight fire with fire. And in so doing, though, I think you're just creating a tons of problems for us. Now, number one, I think every Democrat who's been part of the January 6 hearings has kind of said, look, this is really bad optics. I mean, we're trying to sit here and say, we're trying to raise above this and say, hey, look, the elections are the elections. We need to trust the results of these. But then to basically go in and do something where you're trying to, basically tip the scale in an inter-party primary, whether or not the other side does it, doesn't look great. Two more things. Negative partisanship, which we talk about all the time. Yeah, I mean, sure. Maybe you've helped nominate a candidate who, you think is unelectable. But ultimately, and this is something I say to people, and I'm not pointing out to anybody, but, I think campaigns and the parties, they are so used to terrible polling that they don't even know what it looks like. And this is true on both sides. I mean, in terms of the sort of messages that they test and say like, oh, look what we've learned now. And I think, the idea that, that some of these people are somehow disqualified, I think that might be true if you're like a Democratic strategist. I'm not sure if that's true if you're a Republican voter. And to me, that's where I think, you're ultimately, your Democrats are playing with fire here. I mean, they're promoting candidates who hold fundamentally and, anti-democratic views in a lot of cases, or, whose mere existence in Congress, I think, calls into question, some ways the quality of the institution. But not, I wouldn't say but for Democrats, they wouldn't even have this opportunity, but like, I think you don't even want to have that be a possible criticism you can face. And I think, so I'm pretty one-sided on it. I think, I think there's better ways to spend $400,000 and to support, what they think is an unelectable Republican.
Yeah.
Maybe on the
I think
your
Democrats'
candidates.
judgments of what is an unelectable Republican has not been very good, with one very prominent example.
Well, and exactly. And that's the point. And that's the thing. I mean, your connection to that is exactly right. I mean, the idea that like with
remember how
Trump
the
having
Clinton
paved
campaign wanted to run against Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. What about you? I mean,
I came down the same. I mean, you've done a lot of cleared the underbrush. I mean, I think the risk reward proposition here is not there.
Yeah.
Particularly in this case. I mean, I guess when the stakes are lower, I don't love it as a strategy because of that, because there's too much uncertainty and there's, it's campaign consultants, I think, and, some of my, well, maybe not my best friends. I have good friends in the consulting class anyway. Sure. I think it's a way, I mean, there's a certain dynamic that to me feels like a consultant going, hey, it's what my wife calls, hey, I got a good trick pony for you. Yeah. You know what? And trick ponies, well, and they're trick ponies. They don't race well, right? So there's that. So I think the risk reward thing. And then, the other thing that you're saying that I get in this case in particular, I hate to use the word, but it's ethically not right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, and you're right. Part of it is optics, but sometimes optics and ethics align, and this is one of them. The optics are bad and the ethics are terrible. Yeah.
Well, and especially I say, we're talking about democracy, but we're also sort of, continually talking about information flows in society and disinformation and misinformation. And, I think it really does, hurt the Democrats' credibility, when, let's say, talking about foreign influences in elections, when, you're basically spending this money to essentially create, a misinformation, in some ways, a misinformation campaign about a candidate who is probably, who you, at least at the very least, who you very seriously think is unelectable.
Right. And you're doing it not just because, and again, in this case, they're doing it not just because they think they're unelectable, but because they think they're wrong.
Right.
Wrong in, not just the policy sense, but in the broader institutional ethical sense. And I think it's a loser. And I another minor point in this, though, that is interesting in this is it's another interesting way. And this is tactically a good thing, but again, in the broader sense of things, it's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
It's actually contributed to the January 6th committee's ability to continue functioning with at least some air of bipartisanship.
Yeah.
Because Republicans obviously have to say it's terrible and think it's terrible.
Yeah.
But it gives Democrats a chance to say, this is this is terrible. And I think you have seen evidence of a divide between, there's some divisions among members, but in reading this is completely impressionistic, but in reading the millions of inside newsletters that people that we get and the people that probably listen to this get, the membership for the, in Congress for the most part, particularly in the House where this is happening the most, are not down with this. They don't like it.
No, well, and anybody who knows anything about institutional politics and the relationships between elected officials in these bodies could just imagine.
Right. And it's, and it's an interesting source of tension between members and the campaign arm of the party. Right?
Yeah, and I think, as you say, I think, I tied even to the broader thing. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, we weren't, but I mean, people were talking about Gavin Newsom's ad in Texas and some others just really going after Greg Abbott. And, regardless of the whys, he wants to run for president, et cetera. I mean, there is this sort of clear desire among Democrats to figure out how to be more offensive.
Right.
And Biden's getting a lot of criticism from Democrats about not, going on the offense more, whatever that means. I'm just saying, I read a lot of stuff. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but that's also part of it. I think because it's not, for Democrats, they're not really sure what that means at that point. You are seeing kind of these disparate kind of random, but, I'd say, different efforts of higher and lower quality to kind of go on the offensive. And
to try, I mean, and this is a good transition, to try to drive the agenda and not just be reactive.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And so, which does bring us, and we'll talk, just for a few minutes about this, and we'll come back to it. And we're going to talk about this, obviously, multiple times going forward. But there has been an interesting, amount of attention on the Texas governor's race yet again from outside the state as well as inside the state. Last couple of weeks, couple of articles that have made manifest this ongoing discussion about just how competitive the governor's race is in Texas and why. And again, as we were talking about this, we've talked about this a lot. It's hard not to be at least a little repetitive, but I want to try to avoid that at least a little bit. But the race has gotten a bit of national attention after the last round of polling, including our last UT Texas Politics Project poll, is finding what, seems by consensus to be a single-digit race.
Yeah.
Right, mid-single digits. And again, not news. But, I don't know if this happened to you. And I know you probably almost certainly got press calls on this. In the last couple of weeks, there's been a couple of articles that have kind of made manifest this ongoing discussion about how competitive is this race. I mean, we've seen the polling. We know we know that it's competitive. We've had a lot of polling, including our polling in the last UT Texas Politics Project poll, that shows this race in single digits. I feel like we reached we had one of those little ticks in interest where everybody goes, oh, wow, what's going on in that Texas race? And does Beto O'Rourke have a chance? I think, the trigger nationally for this, I think, was a New York Times article by Houston-based correspondent David Goodman. There was also an op-ed a little after the Goodman article by Mark Jones of the Baker Institute in the San Antonio Express News, both of which in different ways unpacked the various conditions that seem to be making this race more competitive. And, the elements of that, we've laid out in here a lot, and I think are pretty, the school shootings in Uvalde, the revival of, the abortion politics in the wake of Dobbs, and what things look like in Texas.
The grid.
And, the grid is a weird one because, we haven't had more problems with the grid, or at least catastrophic problems since the storm in February of 2021. But the relentlessly hot weather has had everybody on their toes, including ERCOT issuing conservation warnings.
Regular conservation alerts.
Now, this is all pretty speculative at this point. And I don't want to go too far with this because but one of the things that's very funny in both Mark Jones' piece and David Goodman's piece is that there's a long explication of all these things that are making the race more competitive and is making things, like drawing people's attention and making people, consider whether maybe O'Rourke could pull this out. Yet both of those pieces go on at decent length, and then about, the second or third graph before the end have a but still paragraph.
Yeah.
That kind of says, hey, and just to be clear, Mark Jones' thing was an op-ed, so it was a little more direct in saying, look, Abbott is still probably going to win this race.
Yeah.
Right. And David Goodman did a thing where it was artfully done. It kind of pivoted by suggesting with man in the street interviews that people were still kind of thinking about the economy or not thinking about this at all.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think you had a guy eating an ice cream or something going, I don't know, things are pretty good here.
Fine. I did interview this morning on this topic more or less. And it, kind of ended with, it's like, well, but like, wouldn't you still say it's like, the Republicans' race to lose? And my answer is, of course.
Yeah.
Because you know what? They haven't lost a race here in 20 years. So ultimately, even if the state is getting more competitive, until a Democrat can win at the top of the ticket, it's still all it is all the Republicans' races to lose at this point, because there's no indication otherwise. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about all these stories about how the race is tightening and sort of the causality that people are putting to it is like, the race was polling 4 or 5 points before Uvalde and before the Dobbs decision. And so what I'm thinking about more broadly is, I think people, it's natural to want to see patterns, right? We're humans, right? It's natural to want to, draw trend lines through things. We all do it, right? But there's an aspect that I'm kind of looking at right now and saying, well, okay, is the 4 to 6 point lead that Abbott's maintaining right now? I mean, to some extent, there's a question I think that people should be asking themselves, which is, has this already incorporated all of that?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, we had a year-long legislative session in which we were talking about voting rights, we were talking about abortion, we were talking about critical race theory. We were talking about these issues, right? Abbott being up 5, ultimately looks like the trend line that we've been on, right? Where, Abbott
at the top of the ballot.
At the top of the ballot, going from, winning by about 20 to about 12. And then we're seeing people winning by, between 2.5 and 6. And now you see most of the statewide candidates at between 4 and 6 points. Dan Patrick only beat Mike Collier last time by 4.8 points. So the fact that he's polling at about 5 is like, that's about where he was. So to some extent, I think what these articles are, they're not doing it entirely, but I mean, some of it, I would say, Mark, I wouldn't say at all is doing this. I think he's just kind of laying out facts on the ground, and I'm not, and I didn't read the New York Times article as closely, but there is a sort of general sense of like this projection. It's like, well, things have been going bad, and therefore that's why the race is tight. And if that's why the race is tight, maybe it's going to get tighter. Maybe it's going to flip.
Right.
It could get tighter and Abbott could win by 2 points.
Right.
Right. Or what we might see is what we often do, which is, polling in the summer before an election tends to be a little bit more democratically skewed. It's a broader electorate than we see in a midterm. Now,
technically speaking, even though, and we'll bracket actually Mark's poll for U of H, but your Mark is part of that team, but we're still polling registered voters.
Yeah, we're still polling registered voters.
And if you're doing a likely voter screen, artistic, stylistic preference here, I think, although a justifiable one on our part. It's a little soon to be talking about likely voters, in my view.
And I would say also further than that, I mean, I'll just say what we don't know at this point. We really don't know how mobilizing the Dobbs decision is going to be.
Right. And that's why that's why we started with the Kansas thing today. And that's why everybody's starting with the Kansas thing, because it speaks to like one of the most, underdetermined but provocative and major kind of, disruptions. And by the way, Mark used the term exogenous shock in that article. I sent it to Ross.
Yeah.
Ross Ramsey.
Yeah.
And for those of you that have been on this podcast, I think we actually joked about this when we had Ross on the podcast to talk about the poll a few weeks ago. I sent him Mark's article and said, hey, see the last article where he uses the term exogenous shock. And he sent me a one-line response, just said, what's wrong with you people? So,
Lord knows.
Yeah. Big question.
I don't know.
To continue on your point, I think one thing that's sort of occurring to me that I hadn't really thought about that much, or I'd thought about, but not in this way, which is that, one of the things that's interesting about looking at those top of the ballot numbers and all those races you were talking about where last time, the Patrick race was close, the Paxton race was close. 2018, we had the very close O'Rourke Cruz race. But that year, Abbott still won by 14.
Yeah.
Against a very weak, underfunded candidate. But one of the things that's interesting about this is that as we're looking at those trend lines, the story here is not necessarily it's all gone to hell for the Republicans and they're going to lose the governorship. But there is something to be said that, it may be that Governor Abbott, given the kind of conditions we're talking about in the things that have been going on the ground, may be getting dragged into where the rest of the ballot was.
He's lost his cushion. I think that's pretty clear. There's not a distinction between, look, there's a distinction within, again, when you're looking at individual evaluations, there's certainly just a gap between Abbott and everybody else, but he's also just much more well-known than everybody else.
The governor.
So he's the governor. So that's fine. I just want to be clear about what we're saying.
Don't tell the lieutenant governor I said that, but.
Well, I'm going to bring the lieutenant governor into this for a second, but I think, when you're watching campaigns, what I always think is, and I just said, I don't trust campaign polling, but I know that the people, running the campaign do. And ultimately, their actions reflect what they think the conditions on the ground look like. And I think it's notable that, Dan Patrick has already started name checking Mike Collier in the summer, which is, I think, if anybody sort of follows campaigns regularly, if you're an incumbent politician who feels pretty comfortable about your changes, you don't mention your challenger by name ever. Right. There's no point in doing that. he's already, name checking Mike Collier, which I think to me says, that the 5-point races that we're kind of polling that we're seeing everywhere is probably not far off what they're seeing.
Yeah.
And then I would also add to that the fact that, if Abbott were sitting pretty, he wouldn't have made such a big ad buy, so far out in the fall, other than the fact that he's going to be competing for airtime and he's going to be wanting to put out a message that he's going to be spending a bunch of money on. And so again, I think that there's parties say like, well, of course he's going to do that. That's fine. It's like, yeah, maybe he didn't have to against Lupe Valdez, and he spent a bunch of that money on down ballot Republican candidates. He helped Ted Cruz out. He did a lot of other stuff. And ultimately, one of the other side effects of all this, again, I think Republicans are in a pretty safe place at the top of the ballot and certainly down ballot. But to some extent, you can already see that Abbott's looking out for himself very clearly.
Although I think it is, and I don't know the answer to this. I don't remember impressionistically, but I seem to remember the governor doing a pretty big ad buy early last time. And people kind of going, well, why is he doing that? But, I think that the explanation then was that, they are risk averse. They were not going to. So we'll have to go back.
We have to go back. I was going to say, my recollection was that was much more targeted ad buy. I remember in the Lupe Valdez campaign, I remember one of the first kickoff events was sort of the, Hispanics for Greg Abbott kind of. So, they were very much looking to do something specific there, I think, whereas this ad buy is big and broad.
Although, they also tried to do that in 2014.
Yeah.
Where they did another initial Hispanic, but then it got kind of scotched by what was going on the lieutenant governor's race when Dan Patrick first ran, and it was a race to the right.
Yeah.
And the rhetoric on that side kind of just, obstructed that strategy, I think, for the Abbott campaign.
But I guess the point I would make here is, just to wrap this up in some sense, I think if you're an incumbent politician and you can go to the voters and say, look how great everything's going, why would you want to make a change? Then you don't mention the other guy.
Yeah. No, I think.
And I think what you're clearly seeing, that's not the race that we're having right now.
Yeah.
And I think that in and of itself is just look, that's just a fundamentally different race. I think, that's fundamentally something different than what we've seen recently.
Well, 2018 was a fundamental, pretty different context for all these things.
2018 was its own thing. But I think, when people think about Texas and what's interesting, I think, if you were to go back over the last few election cycles, you'd say, for Republicans, these are mobilization elections. If you get your voters out, you're going to win the race. You don't need to acknowledge the Democrats, and you basically just need to say, hey, thank God we're not run like Washington. Thank God Texas is run like this. That argument, a lot tougher to make, and I think you are seeing, an indication that both sides are looking that they probably need to do some persuading.
And not only is it tougher to make, not just than it was in 2018, it's tougher to make than it was 6 months ago.
Yes. Well, that's one of the
things that makes this very interesting and
dynamic. Honestly, right?
Right. In terms of mechanics, there's a matter, you're talking about mobilization. Who has a mobilization advantage right now? I still give it to the Republicans, I think, but that's why the abortion piece is so interesting. Now, they start from a higher baseline, but if you look at the buckets of voters, and, I sort of did this on an informal mailing list I'm with, and then felt kind of stupid because I hadn't put enough of this contextual information in it.
Yeah.
But at some level, it does feed into this, right? If you're the candidates, you're base mobilization.
Yep.
Right. And so you've got Republicans with a well-oiled machine and a seeming advantage there, both in terms of party identification and what we expect the electorate to be.
Yeah.
Asterisk. But still not a big asterisk, right?
No, not a big asterisk.
Then you've got some body of persuadable partisans, which our polling shows is pretty small when it comes to candidate races.
Right.
This is where, the whole point about, the difference between a referendum on abortion and a partisan vote for a candidate is really a big question.
Right.
I think in our last poll, the number of partisan defections was low single digits in each party.
Yeah.
Kind of canceled each other out.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to be trivial within the margin of error probably.
Right.
And then you've got, some thing of weak partisans or independents.
Yeah.
Right. And if you take our estimates, and independents are between 10 and 14% of our samples, more than 40% of them were not committed to either O'Rourke or Abbott in our last poll.
And only some subset of those people will vote.
Right. And then a smaller set of them will vote. The math adds up to the close race that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. And it also, raises sort of, a lot of, I think, not clearly answerable questions about how the campaigns proceed in this environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is where you're seeing a little bit of drag on the Abbott campaign, because I think the path for that for Democrats, ironically, is a little more clear than the path is for Republicans, other than hoping that you can revert to the playbook before the bad 2022 started to unfold with Uvalde.
And you're seeing, I think
abortion and,
there's articles out. We'll get out of this soon, and I'll just say two things. And that's why we hear about immigration and the border all the time, right?
Well,
there are articles out. I think the Tribune did a pretty good job going into depth about the state's sort of juvenile justice system and how it's, as I think their word is collapsing. Sounds like it's collapsing, and and sort of responding to this, the response was, open borders, fentanyl. And it's like, okay,
right,
got it. But, we know what, I think the playbook is very clear, and I think there's advantages to it. But one thing I'll add to your, what you were saying about, the mobilization piece, Democrats are running the same ticket they ran in 2018 at the very top, in some ways, right? It's not exactly, not for governor and lieutenant governor, but, one of the things that you can say, Beto O'Rourke has is he's got lists.
Yeah.
He has lists of Democratic voters. He has lists of people who've worked on his campaign before.
And he's done it before.
And and you know what? Mike Collier has lists.
And has done it before.
And so, even though I certainly give the...
So we're doing the same thing everyone else did.
Well, even though I still give the institutional advantage to Republicans because, again, they've demonstrated an ability to win, and they have it. But that's also to say, this isn't a situation where a new candidate is showing up and is kind of figuring out the ropes on the road. We've been saying it's odd, in prior podcasts, we said it's odd that O'Rourke waited so long to get in the race, even though it was a normal time to get into the race, but he could have done it earlier for other reasons. But, the fact that in the summer before the, quote unquote official campaign, as we think, begins in the fall, the fact that, he's on a 49, day tour with, 60 stops is because, he's done this before.
Yeah.
And that makes a difference.
I don't want to and he can.
And he can, So,
and I think that's also an interesting factor here.
Yeah, and so again, I don't think that's determinative. But when you're looking at all these factors and saying, boy, do we think this is going to be a close race, or do we think we're going to come out on election day and the Republicans are all going to be pretty comfortable? And again, we're not even talking about Ken Paxton. We'll just leave that alone.
Right.
You say, I think there's a lot of reasons to think this race might be tighter, because honestly, the issues that are probably, at least some of the most mobilizing, for Democrats, and I think even for some of these independents who, if you were going to say how might they break Democratic, they're the issues that Abbott does not want to talk about.
This goes back to what we've talked about on here before about, a lot. Campaigns is sort of, fights over what is going to be at the forefront of the agenda of the campaign discussion, which you're trying to, and what you're really doing is trying to push issues in front of the voters.
Yeah.
As you get close to the election. And we've said, ad infinitum, immigration and border security, great Republican unifier, et cetera, et cetera. But it is really striking, given that things are, when we do get reporting there, things are not great at the border.
No.
And they're not great in a lot of ways that a Republican candidate should be able to make hay of.
Yeah.
With a Democrat in the White House.
Right.
But the constant drip of
open border
bad on the other
side,
bad news in the wake of the Uvalde shooting has really just soaked up a lot of bandwidth, in terms of what a colleague would call the politics of attention.
Yeah.
It's really striking. Just, I was making a list and getting ready for this, the number of things, some of which, are not totally surprising, but still a little surprising, that have come out in the aftermath of Uvalde. It's just, they've just, they would never say this, and I don't blame them, and I'm not, casting aspersions on this, but the Abbott campaign really needs that issue to recede.
Yeah.
And I think what has happened is that the issue is that this has not really been about guns. They've done a good job, as we talked about on the last podcast, of obscuring the gun issue, at least at the state level, in terms of the legislative report. But the kind of news that's come out of there has not been about guns. It's been about poor delivery of support to people in Uvalde.
Yeah.
It's been about blame casting. It's been about the lack of clarity on what actually happened still.
Yeah.
It's been about the constant appearance of blame casting among different entities, and just not been able to move beyond it.
Well, and I'd also say, in the sort of shifting of attention, it doesn't really help either, because it's like, well, it's not about guns. It's about the fact that these schools aren't safe. It's like, oh, you mean the schools in Texas that the state government is responsible for. I mean, like, it's just, you kind of go one step down the line and you say, oh, well, that's a little bit of, that's a little difficult.
And that in a way is why it has rebounded to the O'Rourke campaign strategy announced on the Telegraph from the very first day with different issue priority, but that, this is a critique of the stewardship of the state by the party that's been in control for 20 years and a governor running for a third term. And it's, you mentioned all these other issues that I think are, have historically been less salient.
Yeah.
Child, CPS, youth, all of these other issues that are bubbling out there that are traditional Democratic issues that don't get much traction.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, there's something that's a little more additive about it, potentially, I think. And I think that is out there in the mood.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that was, that's kind of, that's kind of what I said 3 months ago. Like, these things could add up. And this was before, we knew that the Supreme Court was probably going to come down with a decision like this, regardless if they did or not. Texas still passed further abortion restrictions. Fact is there was going to be a mass shooting in Texas at some point because Texas is a big place with a lot of guns, and the legislature made it easier to own guns. The thing that I think, I also kind of would put out there as sort of just, watching is, in terms of the drip, drip, drip of, you talk about, sort of the aftermath of Uvalde, but there's also this, the drip, drip, drip about, Joe Biden's open borders. It's like, I just wonder if at some point, that loses some of its power because the reality is the state is spending so much money on border security. I mean, ultimately, the question might be, why hasn't this gotten any better?
Yeah.
Right. And so ultimately, at some point, there is a sort of, aspect to it, which is like, well, if you keep complaining about it and keep talking about it and keep pointing the finger, but at the same time, you're taking money from Child Protective Services and you're taking money from, all these different parts of government, and the price tag just keeps going up and up and up. Something that, again, we pointed out at the end of the session, Republicans were very proud to tout. But at some point, like, do you own some of this, the border crisis?
I mean, and it's been a problem. It's been a problem for the Abbott administration since they really started this increased spending on the border several years ago.
Right.
Right, in which, now it didn't get much attention then because it happened in the legislature and people were like, well, what are we getting for this beyond more traffic tickets in the border region? If this race stays close, I mean, it makes me wonder if this doesn't become, the kind of moment of truth doesn't come in the closing weeks of the campaign. Can Beto O'Rourke thread a needle that says, Democrats believe in border security too.
Yeah.
You have spent, by that time, it'll be probably $4 billion or whatever.
I think it's already over $4 billion.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because they just added more, or they found that they were transferring more, they'd spent more. What have Texans gotten for this? And the Abbott team will be anticipating that question.
Yeah, sure.
What will be the answer to that? Because I think, as you say, the answer so far has been, well, what do you expect us to do? It's the Biden administration's fault. At some point, and maybe we talked about this on air. Now I can't remember. Will there be some kind of messaging from the O'Rourke campaign that says, why does Gregg Abbott blame Joe Biden for all his mistakes?
Yeah, well, and I think, as I think Harvey Kronberg pointed out recently in some Quorum Report thing that he wrote a couple weeks ago, there's a lot of audio that they could use. Yeah. And that's the thing. And the audio is piling up on some of this stuff. It is on both, I think the border piece, but then also on this cumulative piece,
right.
On each of these sorts of elements. And so, so again, having said all that, Abbott's probably going to win. just to come back to this.
Right. Just to get to the second and the last paragraph.
Yeah. But I mean, I think, but overall, I think this is why it's interesting. Again, I'm not sure, honestly, that this isn't already all reflected in the polling.
Yeah.
To be honest. And I think also based on the way that, the differences between the registered voter pool and what turns out to be the actual electorate tends to favor, Republicans a little more. If that's the case, maybe, Abbott ends up winning by 6 or 7 points and is relatively comfortable. But I think, the thing that's interesting is, it's an uphill battle, for Democrats, but they've got a little bit more wind in their back than I think we would have
anybody expected.
Certainly than anybody expected. I agree. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that is what's driving some of this coverage. With that, I think I'm going to flag one more thing before signing off, and that is, this is almost foreshadowing. We talked about John Cornyn's position in the podcast a lot, John Cornyn, basically censured by the Collin County Republican Party this week, and yet another bad break for John Cornyn, which really kind of raises issues about what is going on inside the Republican Party. We'll put a pin in that for next week or the week after. On that, I want to thank Josh for being here. Thank our excellent crew here in the audio studio, in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin, because I knocked the mic off the stand a couple of times thrashing around. So thank you guys for the extra help. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. Be sure and look for data supporting material and other goodies at our website, the Texas Politics Project. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.